Hey, everybody. I don't know about you, but I am getting a little exhausted with coronavirus content. So we're going to change the topic a little bit for today's show and talk about one person's struggle with hundreds of thousands of dollars of debt from one of the most expensive art schools in the country. And this is particularly juicy today because there was a viral story that started going around the internet a couple days ago. Basically, a bunch of students at NYU Tisch School of the Arts, which is one of the country's preeminent art schools out there. All these students asked for a refund or a partial refund because their semester was partly canceled because of coronavirus, and they get charged like 30 grand per semester. The response of the dean of that school was to say basically no, and then also included in that email, she sent a video of her dancing to REM's Losing My Religion, lose my religion, like that one. So really, really out of touch, super tone deaf, and also just kind of disgusting, frankly, for a university that has billions of dollars in assets and real estate assets all around the city of Manhattan. So I think that was really kind of interesting, just showing some of these schools' lack of empathy for students who are being charged a huge amount of money to go to these institutions. So it's kind of real funny that the person I'm interviewing today went to that school. Also, please note that we will probably have a bonus episode detailing all of the changes with the new stimulus bill that passed Congress that Trump signed into law. So that's got a lot of changes in it. We're getting a lot of your questions. Go to studentloanplanner.com/voicemail if you want to ask a question about the stimulus bill, and we're going to probably do a special show on it. But for now, enjoy today's show.
It was not anything like what they had told us in school, which is like you intern, then you get a low-paying job, and then you just work really hard at that, and you get, a regular paying job or something. None of the people that I knew who were interning at that time got any chance to ever move into a paid role.
Welcome to the Student Loan Planner podcast. Today, I have a fascinating guest on the show to talk about how she accumulated 6 figures of student loan debt from film school in one of the most expensive cities in the world, and how she's encouraging others to pay back their student loan debt. And we're going to get into a bunch of numbers, and I'm going to push back a little bit on some of the ideas and debate some of the stuff. And it's going to be a super interesting show, I think. So welcome, Stephanie Bousley, to the show. How are you doing, Stephanie?
Hi, Travis. Thank you so much for having me. It's a pleasure.
Yeah, sure. So can you tell us how much debt you racked up and how, and just tell us who you are and what's your story?
I guess I fall into the millennial category. I was born in 1982, so I think I'm actually like the first year of millennial. So I went to college in the early 2000s, and I did not attend with the support of basically nobody paid my way through school. I paid for it myself, and I worked 3 jobs, and I finished undergrad with only about $15,000 of debt, which isn't great, but it wasn't like end your life type of debt.
Yeah, 15,000 is like a bad credit card decision or something like that.
Yeah, exactly. And so I always had this belief that if I just worked hard and found something that I was passionate about, that would allow me to, have the career I want and the life I want and be happy. When I made the decision to go to grad school, I kind of went with the same approach that if I just worked really hard and got some jobs and did some on-campus work, I could probably cover the cost of school without going too far into debt. That was kind of, I guess, what prompted the decision. And if I'm being really honest, the decision to go to grad school was also prompted by me being 26 years old and feeling like I wasn't quite sure what I wanted to do, and this would be a good way to get the best education on the thing that I was interested in, which at that time was film.
So you took out a degree for film school, is that correct?
Yeah, my master's degree is in film production.
Okay, film production. And what school did you go to, if you can share that?
I went to New York University, and their graduate program is a 3-year full-time program. And then you can matriculate for an additional, I think, up to 2 or 3 years while you're making your thesis project.
Okay.
So when I got into NYU, I realized pretty quickly that it was a lot more involved than undergrad had been for me, even though I had double majored in undergrad and worked really hard. I just did not have the time to work because we were literally shooting projects all day long, Saturday, Sunday. And it just was a different situation where I couldn't put in the hours to make money like I was able to in undergrad. So, the debt started to accumulate. And of course, there was a certain degree of not wanting to look at that or feeling like there was no reason to look at it because I didn't have the money to pay it off. And I was just trying to finish school. So, yeah, by the time I graduated, I had been matriculating for 2 years while I finished my 5 film projects. And by the time I was done, it had compounded several times. And I think the balance about 2 years after I graduated was up to about $286,000.
Wow. Wow. So 286,000, 2 years after you graduated, it took you how many years to graduate?
I went to school 3 years full-time tuition and 2 years matriculating. So it took 5 years.
So wait, so tell me what matriculating means.
So I graduated as a producer, which means I had to produce 5 NYU films to get my degree.
Okay.
I was doing film productions in Asia with some of the students that were shooting there. So it was a really interesting life. It was like go to Nepal for 6 months and work on a project there and then go to the Philippines. So I ended up doing that, but it took about 2 years by the time we raised all the money for 5 different films and did the pre-production, production, and post-production.
Okay. 5 years. Were you able to borrow for 3 of those years or all 5 of those years?
I borrowed for 4 of those years.
4 of those years. Okay. So that's $280,000 when you graduated. And, film school is famous for not having huge salaries after that, I think, right? Is that fair?
Yeah, that's very fair. Well, actually, when I was going to school, I tried to do some internships so I could at least get work experience and graduate with a paying job. And I went to LA. I did a couple internships there. I did 1 or 2 internships in New York as well. But at this time, the year was like 2011. So the market had just crashed, a couple of years ago. And it was not anything like what they had told us in school, which is like you intern, then you get a low paying job, and then you just work really hard at that and you get, a regular paying job or something. None of the people that I knew who were interning at that time got any chance to ever move into a paid role.
So you had a $280,000 student loan debt with basically no way to get a high paying job after school.
Yeah, I mean, and I know that sounds crazy, but keep in mind, like, I just always thought I could work my way out of it, right? Like, my grandfather was a farmer. I graduated always at the top of my class. I got into good schools. Just the idea that I could have this thing over my head, which made me look so irresponsible, kind of didn't compute for me because it felt like, how could that happen? So it was a big source of shame and secrecy for a long time because it just felt so unlike me to have that type of debt.
So you went to school from what years during your program? Like, were you enrolled?
2007 fall, and I finished in May of 2012.
That means that you would have missed eligibility for the pay-as-you-earn program probably by 1 or 2 months.
I think, yeah. But I did eventually consolidate my debt into some of the government. It was called at that time income-based repayment, IBR.
Yep, the IBR plan.
Yeah, so that was kind of, I think it was marketed to people like, oh, if you just pay your debt responsibly for 20 years, it'll get forgiven. And so you don't really need to worry. You only need to pay a certain percentage of your salary, so you're not going to default. That all sounded great, but it was brand new, so there wasn't a lot of fine print to read around that. I had been paying back the debt on IBR for probably a year or more, And I had this partner and he was just like, well, what if it doesn't get forgiven, because I was only paying a small percentage of what I was making. I wasn't defaulting. I was paying my bill in full every month, but I was actually earning more interest on the loan each month than what my payment was. So the loan was actually getting bigger over time, not smaller. So I started to worry, what if it's not forgiven? And then in 20 years, I owe the government $1 million or something crazy like that. And when I started to read into it more, I learned that the debt, if it was forgiven, counts as income on your taxes. So you have to pay tax on that amount. So I plugged in my debt numbers to Excel and I learned that even if I paid this minimum for 20 years and got the rest forgiven, I would owe something like $600,000 in income taxes that year. And so I didn't want to be 50 and then owing this even bigger sum of money to the government. It just felt like a crazy maze that I was trapped in.
So have you been trying to pay your debt back? Is that what you've been trying to do?
Yeah. So my book is kind of about how holistically I dealt with the debt and also what I actually did, right? So I go through all the things. So at the start of this process, I had very poor credit. I had a job working as like a nanny. I owed all this money and I couldn't get any kind of consolidation thing because my debt to income ratio was so huge and my credit was not good.
You couldn't refinance your debt, yeah, because the payments would be $2,800 a month.
Yeah, I got super, I was rejected from every single time I applied. And that felt bad because it felt like I was being rejected as a person. Like I'm so irresponsible and so horrible.
That people don't want to lend to you.
Yeah, like people like won't even touch me. That was when I started to really think about why people commit suicide over debt. And it really made sense to me that someone would do that because it just felt like a death sentence. It was like, I'm going to be in debt living this way my whole life until I'm old.
Did you feel trapped?
Yeah. And no one was really talking about it either. I mean, people talk about it now a little more, but even with my own classmates who had the same amount of debt, it's like we would just pretend we didn't have it. We would talk about our films we're making or our internship we're working.
Hey, did you watch the Academy Awards the other day or something?
Yeah. It's like, but in the meantime, we're all so financially effed, for lack of a better word.
Yeah, I think that's accurate.
Yeah. So basically, I made a lot of changes. I ended up getting a chance to work abroad in a country with a much lower income tax rate. And that allowed me to save and put about $20,000 to $30,000 per year additional to what I was paying on the debt. And every time I would make a little more money or get a raise, debt would be paid off for like 6 months more. I would just wait and then I would try to refinance again. And so my whole goal just became getting my monthly payment down to a lower interest rate. So when I made the payments, they were actually reducing the total debt. That was the only thing I focused on for the first year.
So tell me, how much have you paid down your debt so far?
I've now paid off, I think, $150,000.
Yeah. So what is it down to?
And I have about $130,000 left.
Yeah.
If I get a little extra bonus at work, whatever, I usually do throw that at the debt. But more broadly, I think what was important was that I had to learn how to accept the debt, accept that I had made these decisions and gotten myself into this place, and really make some big changes in my life in terms of my career. I ended up going to work at a hedge fund as an assistant for 5 years, living abroad. I also started to pay for things that I thought would add value to my life and to me as a person, rather than following the traditional advice of just don't spend any money, put all your money towards your debt, because I didn't want to punish myself every day for the next 10 plus years.
Well, I actually love the title of your book, Buy the Avocado Toast, and it's coming out at the end of March. Is that right?
Yeah, March 31st.
Okay. This is very interesting because this is a wonderful case study as to how you will end up being financially well off. But I would argue not because of the loan strategy, it's because of your savings rate. So if you were my client, I would have pushed back extremely hard on you paying back this student loan debt, because that is a common sentiment that I hear with IBR. Like, what if they take it away? First of all, when has the government taken anything away that's a social safety net program for current borrowers? I'm not talking about like taking it away, period, right? But if you look back, you can pretty much almost never find a case of the government pulling something away from people that are currently pursuing it. Like Social Security, they just raised the retirement age, but for people that were born 20 years later than people that are getting it today. That would be point one, is that they're not going to take away IBR, period. 99% chance it's going to be here. So that means you can pay 15% of your income with the loans forgiven after the 25 years, and you pay income tax on that, right?
Mm-hmm.
That's the IBR plan. But the second point that I would make is the calculation of the interest was off. The interest with student loans grows at a simple rate of interest, not a compounded rate of interest. So I actually just made an estimate of what your interest would be. Actually, while you were talking, I plugged it into my own calculator because the one on the government website is pretty lousy, in my opinion, at least. So I assumed that you would make about $40,000 a year. It's probably going to be larger than that, right?
Yeah, now it's about quadruple that. Yeah.
Yeah. So it's like you're making quite a lot of money. So I assumed a really low number, which, forgiveness would look a lot worse if you're making a lot more money. So for example, I came up with the remaining balance. If you had only a $40,000 income and you're paying like $200-$300 a month, your remaining balance would have grown from $280 to about $660.
Mm-hmm.
It didn't quadruple because it's not compounding. A lot of people don't understand that. That's the first point. Now, the second point is the income tax on that $660K would be about $265,000, not about $600,000. That's just, again, because of that simple rate of interest versus the compounded rate of interest. If I look at the cost in today's dollars of pursuing IBR versus refinancing back in 2012 for you, before you made this commitment to pay down your debt, the cost of going for the income-based option is about half of the cost of going for the full refinancing option. In 2016, the revised pay-as-you-earn plan got passed. So that's something that you couldn't have seen coming because it didn't exist when you were in school. So you couldn't have seen that coming. But so what that allowed you to do is to pay, instead of 15% of your income, it allows you to pay 10% of your income.
Mm-hmm.
So that's an even lower payment, and it subsidizes the interest. That's a nice subsidy. And so then that would have cut the cost further down to where the repay would have been about 1/3 of the cost of paying it back in full. But you can't go back and change the past. You can change the present. So you made all this progress. You have it down to $130,000, and you're making quadruple the $40,000 number that I threw out there. So then now you have a debt to income ratio better than 1-to-1. You're in this position where it would be silly to go for forgiveness because you're not going to get anything forgiven because you pay down so much. The good news is this: if you compare using the perfect loan strategy to the wrong loan strategy, that will cost you about 1 to 2 years extra of your working life. Like, you will have to work 1 or 2 years longer than you would have otherwise had to work. But you know how to save now. And so if you compare yourself right now with how much you've saved and how responsible you've become with your finances versus what you were doing, even if you had been on the IBR plan and stayed on that plan, that's actually going to save you probably more than a decade off of your working career. So while I'm an advocate for people using the best loan strategy with having a high savings rate, you basically found this sort of like spiritual awakening where you're like, I don't want this debt to rule my life anymore. And you overcame that. Is that accurate, Stephanie?
I think it is accurate. And it also had a lot of coming to terms with just really the choices I had made and the choices I was making at the time. With the debt came a lot of depression, anxiety. It really made me feel like I was a slave to my job because I needed that good paying job. And so it was very hard for a while to just get out of bed, not resentfully, and go work that job, even though I was very lucky to have it. When I accepted responsibility, like I'm not a bad person, I just made some poor financial choices, but I'm not going to wait for someone to rescue me from the debt or elect someone that will just forgive it or whatever. I want to feel like I have choices in my life and I'm not owned by this one choice I made back in 2010.
That's a wonderful feeling, right? And we had somebody else on the podcast who was a dentist who was making that conscious choice to pay back her debt, even though she had so much, right? Another concern I have is this debt is so large because, and feel free to avoid this question because, it's about NYU, but like, I feel like NYU is one of the most, this is my personal opinion. I think they're one of the most deceptive, predatory institutions in the entire country. Their medical school program, they gave free tuition. But if you look at what they did, they just slashed the size of their medical school a ton to garner an awesome headline to give more scholarships to brain surgeons and orthopedic surgeons instead of primary care doctors that are going to serve in rural America, because everybody's going to have a perfect MCAT score that's going to get these scholarships probably.
Mm-hmm.
And then if you look at the dental school and the other schools, they run factory-sized level classes where they trade off of the prestige of NYU to attract all these folks. And then they load people up on the student loan debt because they can just say the cost of attendance is this, and the student loan programs just cover that in full based on the current rules. Would you agree with that or disagree with that, and why?
I would totally agree with that. And I too found myself often feeling like, wow, it's really just enough for them to say, hey, you're at NYU, you should feel lucky to
Grateful.
be here.
Pray at the altar.
Right. And not to say that I didn't have some excellent instructors while I was there, but sometimes I think even the instructors are like struggling to make ends meet because they have debt too a lot of the time, or they're trying to work in the film industry, and they're not really getting paid that much to teach either in comparison to what we, the students, are paying. So yeah, over the years, I've definitely become wiser to the NYU tricks of the trade, so to speak. I remember when I first got accepted, they were kind of like, here's a loan from Citibank. Citibank is the only person who will give you the loan. So sign here, then you can start in the fall. And so I did that, and I kind of believed that, which was very naive because I probably could have figured out a way to get a way lower interest rate than 8.5% for those loans. At the time, they just were kind of like, this is the standard operating procedure.
They normalize it, right?
Yeah, and they were sued for that in a class action later because the guy from NYU ended up moving to Citibank to work there directly instead of just pushing the loans through NYU. And then, of course, there was the other scandal where they were using the alumni fund to give people 0% interest rates to build their Hamptons homes and stuff like that, which you can read all about in the New York Times. Yeah, I do think there was a lot of naivete on my part about just thinking, oh, if I have that good name on my degree, I'll be all set, and that really wasn't the case. And a lot of the time, I even remember being in classes where we would talk about getting out of school, and they were still pushing these kind of old ideas of like, get an internship, then it'll turn into a job, then you'll work for some production company. That wasn't the reality of what we were seeing when we went out into the world. And I wish I would have been a little bit smarter on that too, instead of just taking everything they gave me as an institution as like the gospel.
Yeah, well, there's no accountability, right? So I could tell you that 97% of our NYU grads get cast as Batman in leading roles, and the other part get cast as Wonder Woman, right? Like I could just make up total nothing, total BS, and there's no accountability. There's no requirements at all. So like, I think that if you look at the American student loan system, compare it to the other student loan systems that are out there, in the UK, you can pay based on your income as well. But the huge difference is the UK system has a maximum amount that you're allowed to borrow.
Mm-hmm.
The UK sets the tuition. They're the ones that control like how much you can get for student loans. But the schools in America have been given that option. And, they don't care because at the end of the day, it's like, can we make our institution as big and rich and powerful and influential as possible? If so, then me running NYU, I get a larger paycheck. I get more plaudits. I get promoted, that kind of thing. I do want to cover like how you were able to pay so much on this. You moved abroad. Like, did you have to sacrifice your dream in the film industry, or did you did? So tell me about that.
Yeah, so I paid off a lot of debt through a couple of methods. The first one was that when I was finishing my thesis, I met an American family abroad in Singapore, and she allowed me to work kind of part-time as her assistant while I was in between film shoots, right? So I would be based in Singapore and she was paying me like $25 an hour or something. And sometimes I would house sit for them. But I worked really hard at that job, and it ended up leading to another job working in the husband's hedge fund as his assistant. For people that don't know a lot about finance, it's very much like you get your paycheck and then you get your bonus, which can be up to, several months worth of paychecks. So that first year I was at the hedge fund, I think my base salary was 70 or 75,000, which was still higher than the $55,000 job I had before.
In Singapore.
But I was in Singapore. So I wrote off my first 100K of income under the foreign earned income tax break. My bonus that year was, I think, about 50,000, which was a surprise to me because I had made my life work on the 70,000, So when I got this extra bonus, it was like kind of a surprise. So I worked at that job for about 5 years, and I got a raise every year and I got a bigger bonus every year. I was paying US income tax on the amount that was over the whatever barrier was that year, usually about 100,000. So that means like if I make $150,000 abroad, I write off the first 100,000. The US thinks I make only 50,000 and I'm paying taxes on that.
Yeah.
Singapore at that time was kind of a hotbed for trying to get expats to work there. So our income tax in Singapore was like around 10%, I think, in the beginning. So I was saving considerably on taxes. When I moved back to the US, I was earning a little under 200K. And by that time, I had actually bought a small rental property near where my parents live. So I was earning a little bit of extra income per month on that.
What were you doing for 200K?
I was an assistant, and you can actually make that much money if you're really good.
That's really interesting. So if you felt financially like you could have pursued the film industry, would you have pursued it?
That's a very good question. Truthfully, I don't know, but this is the way that my life panned out, and I'm not complaining.
That's good.
Is what I can say.
No, that's a great attitude to have. So like, I just want people to, because the thing is you borrowed with tuition dollars that were 10 years ago, basically, right? Like it was the prices 10 years ago. And let's say the version of you is going to NYU now for film school, and they're going to be borrowing at double the cost. So I just want to make sure that that person knows that they have options. So this alternative option would be basically that you could have paid under that IBR plan, your effective tax rate would have been about, it's 15%, but it's 15% of just that amount over 100,000. That's an amount like that's 15% of over the 100,000 mark. So that's like about $500 a month that you would have had to pay on under IBR. When you're paying under an income-based program, your payment on your student loans is really more like a tax rather than a debt. So you have to save up for that tax bomb, or else you're not going to be able to pay that tax in the 25 years, right?
Right.
What we tell people is you have to figure out what percent of your income you have to put away for the tax bomb. And on top of that, what percent do you have to pay the government for your student loans? So if you look at like a lower earning film type of income, what you could have done is be an IBR or repay paying about 8 to 12% after deductions as a tax based on your income. So and it would only be about that amount of your pre-tax income. And then on top of that, about 2 to 4% of your income would have need to have gone in mutual funds. So in other words, what my point is this. For that year in Singapore, the alternative strategy could have been you socking away money in cash savings, paying off any kind of credit card debt that you had, making sure that you were really financially secure, where you had 1 or 2 years worth of savings in the bank. And then you could have gone on and taken an aggressive, low-paying film job and then basically pay a percentage of your income and know that your student loan debt is actually a tax, and actually your real debt is actually zero, because your student loan debt with the federal government is literally a tax and that's it, which is, in our experience with clients, is very freeing for them.
I'm sure.
They can pursue that dream. And I'm really glad that you pursued the life that you felt made you the most comfortable. And you've been very, very successful at that. I don't want to downplay that at all. I'm just saying that for that person that's listening now that's going to one of these type of programs, your debt is actually zero. It's a tax. which gives people the option to not have to work for that, hedge fund family and making six figures doing something that you might not be passionate about.
I think that's really important to tell people. And I wish I would have had someone like you available to me back then, because it would have helped me a lot. I think, unfortunately, because I was kind of the first at the beginning round of people getting into this type of debt, there just really weren't that many resources to me at the time where I could figure out, what my options really were, which was unfortunate.
So I love your book title, though, Buy the Avocado Toast. What we tell people is this, and you can tell me if this is kind of in line with what your book recommends. So what we find is that you can eat avocado toast until they have to pull out your gallbladder. I don't know if that's, I don't know what happens if you eat too much avocado toast, if it's liver or your gallbladder, I have no idea, right? But whatever it is, you can gorge yourself on avocado toast, and it's not going to make nearly as big of an impact as trying to increase your income or trying to watch out for spending too much on your housing or not buying a car on credit when you should just go buy like a $5,000 2006 Toyota Camry instead, which is more matching with what you can afford. So maybe you can talk a little bit about the key components of your book.
It's about just working smarter, I think, at the most basic level. It's all the things that you said are absolutely the same things I advocate. When I see people with $100,000 plus student loan debt getting told to, drive Uber, just like don't go to Starbucks every day or whatever. I mean, those changes are not going to make the kind of dent that people really need. It kind of only prolongs the feeling of I'm a loser, I made poor choices, I hate my life, blah, blah, blah.
Mm-hmm.
So, yeah, when I talk about earning more money, I don't just talk about getting a second job, which are, in my opinion, very rarely worth the effort. I think about how to make bigger steps like reducing your income tax, getting a higher salary, getting the courage to look at your financial picture, no matter how bad it is, and how to reward yourself, even sometimes with spending money, just to keep you feeling like you're on the path and you're making progress in your life, not just punishing yourself day in and day out, which I think is really important.
Yeah, I think that's so great.
And another thing I talk about is fixing your credit score. That was a big part of my story as well, because I ended up ultimately getting off the IBR and refinancing through Sophie and Mohela. And I've actually refinanced now probably 5 times to just lower the interest rate again and again.
That's music to my ears. Half of our readers don't know you can even do it more than once.
Oh, yeah. I've done it like at least 5 times, even for other reasons too. Like when I moved back to the States, I couldn't pay as high as what I had been paying in Singapore. So I refinanced just in that case to get a slightly lower monthly rate so I could afford to live in California. But prior to that, yeah, if I just got it, I would just get it down by 1 percentage point, 8.5 to 6.8 to 5.9 to 4.5, because the more money I made and the more I paid it off, the better rates were available to me. So I took full advantage of that too. And I think a lot of people don't really realize how everything stems from your credit score and how you actually can take steps to fix it in a shorter amount of time than just waiting for the bad things to go away.
Do you know about our refinancing bonuses? I'm curious if you've ever seen our site before with those refinancing links.
No, not the refinancing links.
So here's another great tip. Going from like SoFi to like another company to another company, like that's called like the refinancing ladder. So you can step down like interest rates, but you can also step down terms. What we tell people is start with a 20-year, to keep your payment kind of low and just not stress yourself out too much, and then pay down a bunch extra because there's no prepayment penalty, and then refinance it to like a 15-year, and then pay a bunch extra, and then do a 10-year and then pay a bunch extra, and then end up where like your last refinance is to like a 5-year variable rate when you're like almost done.
Mm-hmm.
And so like the extra way you could have saved money if you'd found out about us back in the day is we give people negotiated deals where they get anywhere from $100 to $775 to refinance their student loans through our site instead of like going directly to the lender.
Wow.
Yeah. So most people just type in like refinance student loans on Google, right? The pages that show up are these like mega personal finance companies that spend like $1 gazillion trying to make sure they show up at the top of Google, and they give no bonus to the readers. So all they have is like a lot of information about refinancing, which is fine. And they have a bunch of companies that you can apply to, and then they take the entire commission. So like Student Loan Planner, one way we're different is we take lower commissions than those other places do so that we can rebate some of that back to our readers in the form of them getting a sign-up bonus too.
Amazing.
Well, yeah. So like you were pitching us to be on the show based on your book. And when I heard the title, I was really excited. But yeah, so that's, those 5 refinances, in addition to those interest rate savings, you could have probably gotten $500 each time, at least when you refinanced. So that would have been like $2,500 too on top of that. That would have been nice to have as well.
Yeah, it would have been nice.
What's your current interest rate and who's your lender?
I think my loan got sold to Union Bank.
Mm-hmm.
And I just paid off the last of the money that was in the SoFi one. Yeah, is it Union Bank? I think that's what it is. But I should look again because it's been over a year since I last refinanced, and I probably can get it down even lower.
What's the interest rate?
My interest rate, I think it was 3.86 and 4.5 on the other one.
Okay, what are the terms?
The lower one was on a 10-year term.
Mm-hmm.
And then the higher one, I think, is 15. But honestly, I would have to look because I've done it so many times. I forget exactly the interest rate.
I think that what I would do is, you can go to studentloanplanner.com/refi. I tell people as a starting point, apply to all the lenders with the new email address. If you've applied a bunch before, apply with the new email address to all the lenders in the top of that page. See who's offering a good pre-qualified rate. And then whoever's offering a good pre-qualified rate actually take the time to upload the documents, like your ID, like you just take a picture of your ID and like you're familiar with it, right? But your loan payoff information, your income, pay stubs, your tax returns, right? Don't waste your time with the other ones. Just do the pre-qualified checks with the other ones. That takes a few minutes to see if they could give you something good, and then go through with the process and actually like submit all the docs. So like because of coronavirus right now, the interest rates for student loan refinancing are like the lowest they've ever been.
Nice.
So, yeah, you should definitely, and this time maybe you'll get a cash bonus instead of using the random company that doesn't give anything to people.
Yeah.
It's kind of like when you sign up for the airline credit card, imagine like getting no bonus miles versus getting like 50,000 bonus miles. It's kind of a no-brainer if you know it exists, but you have to know it exists to get it.
I would also encourage people during this refinancing process, it's really important to just kind of detach yourself from that person on the application, I found, because I almost didn't want to keep trying to refinance in the very beginning because those rejections felt so painful and personal. I almost didn't want to put myself through another one.
Yeah.
And now I just think, well, whatever, there's a million financial institutions out there. I just apply. I pick the best rate. Some people will say yes. Some people will say no. Has nothing to do with me. And to really detach myself from that process.
Yeah, that's a really great point. So can we talk about just the anxiety? Did you have anxiety and depression from your student loans at one point?
Oh, yeah, for sure.
Can you just tell us where you were at? Like, what was the darkest point for you with your student loans, if you can share that, if that's comfortable?
I was struggling a lot with alcohol abuse. I was smoking cigarettes. I guess I just want to stress that it was sort of a life of like, get up at 5 a.m. I don't like where I'm going to work. I don't like the fact that I'm going to spend 12 to 15 hours in that office. I don't like feeling like I have to live this way because I made poor choices with my student loans. It really was just hard not to give up altogether, to be honest. When I was writing my book, I went on a lot of sites on Reddit and so forth where people were talking about debt and depression and suicide. And, there are so many people out there who are just really suffering, and it's sad.
What was the hardest part? Like, what was the chief depression and anxiety? Was it feeling like you're just trapped for life? Like it's a prison sentence?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I would say that is it. Yes.
What did it prevent you from?
Well, I would date people and then I would be like, when do I tell them I have this debt? And when I tell them, will they want to still go out with me, right? So I was living abroad. A lot of expats in Singapore work in the banking industry or lawyers or kind of very professional jobs. And I didn't want to tell a lawyer I was dating that, oh, by the way, I have this super irresponsible looking history of debt with my student loans.
Yeah.
And just feeling like, well, I could never afford to get married. I can never afford to buy a house, have children. How can I do any of those things ever now that all my money has to go to this debt? The only way I can even meet the needs of the debt is if I work a job I don't like. So all of that felt very dark. And I did what people do in those situations, go home and drink, try to forget about it, try to distract myself from it, and feeling so guilty even when I would spend money on anything like a yoga class. Like, oh, did I really need that yoga class? Did I really need, to do that? I should have saved that $25. And that is the prison in and of itself, just feeling like anytime you spend money, it's wrong and you're a mess up who shouldn't get anything nice in life.
Yeah.
It's kind of how I felt. And so I talk in my book a lot about dealing with those things as well, just not being defined by your debt or your job title or what have you, because we never have to apologize for a paycheck. And we never have to apologize for doing something different than the thing we went to school for. Those are very personal choices, and they're not an indication of success or failure or good versus bad. And that's really important for me when I talk to people in debt to tell them.
That's so wonderful. I mean, we can crush the math with this all day and show people like the right strategy and like relieve that psychological burden, but we can't kind of speak to that spiritual like state as much, because that's just such an intense feeling. And it's just so, I think, helpful for people that are going through something similar to read something like your book, just to kind of relate to that and know that they're not alone in those emotions.
Yeah. And the more I started talking about my debt, the more I would hear other people in the same situation and say like they never said the number out loud, or they just don't even look at the balance. They have it on auto pay because it's so shameful to them. So I think my book is kind of like the therapist for your strategy, like getting the actual work done, but also like motivating yourself to look at that part of your life honestly.
Well, thank you so much for being on this show. Where can our listeners find out more about you?
So my website is www.youarenotyourdebt.com, all as one word. And my book, Buy the Avocado Toast, is available on Amazon, Barnes & Noble, and Target starting on March 31st. But you can also pre-buy it so that you receive it on that day.
Awesome. So buy the avocado toast, but don't buy the house and the car unless you do it responsibly and you've run the numbers before. Stephanie Bousley, everyone, Buy the Avocado Toast author. Thank you so much for being on the show.
Thank you, Travis. And it's great to meet another person who's an ally in helping people with student debt.